So we're going to wait just a couple more minutes. I think we're still waiting on one more person, but if she's not here in the next 3 minutes, we'll go ahead and get started. So you should have a few documents. One, you should have access to the deck that we're using today. And then also Sam has to drop out of the meeting for another obligation. And he, so it's unclear where we'll be in the agenda, but he provided his thoughts because we're going to do like a share out about your high level thoughts on the applicants. So he provided those in writing and I just shared those in the Dropbox with everyone. And Susanna is here. I don't see her, but I see her on the list, but I don't see face. But
yeah, same here. Sorry, turn my camera on.
Great. Then I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see the slides?
Justin, I just have one administrative matter. Thank you everyone for completing the conflict of interest and the non-disclosure agreement. Akeem, I'm just waiting on yours.
Yes, I'm the only one who has to send that in. So I'll get that to you today.
Okay,
I don't have a printer
thank you.
here, so like I have to go into the office to print.
Feel free to also do it electronically with an electronic signature. You don't need to. I don't need a signature.
All right.
We can accept electronic signatures. That's fine.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get our third meeting of the DC RPP Review Committee called to order. There should be a deck in the Dropbox along with another document. Sam will need to excuse himself from the meeting, but wanted to provide some thoughts about the applicants in advance to the review committee in case he misses his opportunity to sort of to share out. So the agenda for the meeting today is as follows. Thank you for submitting in your rubrics for the for your review of the application. I will provide an overview of those summative scores in this presentation. We will also have some time for you to discuss and deliberate as a committee. And then with the action item on the agenda to determine how we plan to use our, again, we said that we were going to try to get to a final decision in 6 meetings. This is our third, so we're about halfway there. So figuring out our roadmap to how we're going to use the next 3 meetings and how you would wish to proceed to getting to consensus. Does that sound good? Okay, we'll continue. So overview of total summative scores. So the first slide is just total points. So if you just sum up the points, and these are as follows. So you can read the table yourself. We bolded the highest scores for emphasis here, and you can see that outlined in the table. So this is just the sum of the point values is total score, the mean score, of course, the average, and then the median as the median. Consensus. So what we did here is that we just because the law, the RPP authorizing law requires consensus by having at least 2 members appointed by the mayor and 2 members appointed by the council to select an application. We went and we just concealed the identity of the responder, but gave an indicator of whether they were a mayoral pick or a council pick. So M corresponds to mayor, C corresponds to council. So across the panel, 3 scores rated the Urban Institute the highest. 1 scorer had them tied, and I think 2 scorers had George Washington as the highest. So again, based on the scores from the initial review of applications, the consensus required by the law has not taken place. Is not there just by a straightforward face review of the applications. And you can see that shaded, the score shaded in green. So it looks like mayoral appointees are divided with a tie from 1 mayoral appointee, and then council appointees have 2 for Urban Institute and 1 for George Washington, but there is an agreement there isn't the 2-2 agreement required by the law yet. Then we took the average scores by domain. So remember, we spent time walking through the notice of invitation and categorizing point values and putting the individual requests from the notice of invitation into what we call domains. So you'll see the domains: knowledge and expertise, partnership and collaboration, data use and protection, research methods, financial management, and proposed budget on the left-hand side. And then you'll see the average score of each. We've highlighted in bold the applicant that got the highest average of points in each of those domains. So for knowledge and expertise, it was the Urban Institute. For partnership and collaboration, it was George Washington. For data use and protection, it was George Washington. And for research methods and financial management, for research methods, it was the Urban Institute, and then it was a tie for financial management and proposed budget. Are there any questions about this overview of summative scores?
I can't seem to find the Dropbox link in my email. Is it possible to resend that out?
I think it's called handouts. Like if you click on handouts down there, there's a little triangle, and it should say handouts 2 of 5. There should be 2 handouts in there. If you look on your command function. If not, I can, when we get to a stop, when you all are talking, I can email them. Do you see it, Suzanne?
Oh yeah, so it's within GoToMeeting. Okay, yeah. Or webinar or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Leveraging the technology. Are there any thoughts on the data? Pretty self-explanatory for you all, I think. All right, great. So we will go on, and the next part of the meeting is all yours, right? But I did try to provide a little bit of structure to sort of facilitating conversation and helping you get to what your next steps are going to be. So I put together a few discussion topics. I recommend that you each go around the committee and take 5 minutes to sort of summarize your strengths and weaknesses of the application to the group. You can do that. You can organize that any way that you would wish. You can talk about all the applicants. You can talk about the only applicants you can describe your justification for why you scored the way you did or why you scored one the highest. Just taking 5 minutes to sort of provide your overarching thoughts about strengths and weaknesses of the applications. I also think that it would be beneficial for you to discuss the specific components of the application in which to compare and where there's ambiguity and where you would like to think about more information. And then we can talk about potential next steps after discussion. So does it work for the group if we do sort of just a 5-minute whip around on strengths and weaknesses? And then I think maybe we should allow Sam to go first since he might have to drop off. So Sam, if nobody has any objections to that, I think we'll just proceed with you and I'll mute.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks everyone for accommodating. I signed up for a panel at a conference like 5 months ago. That happens to be right now, so I can't move from it. But Katie, I think the one attendee, Katie Gann, which is my deputy director, who's just going to be listening in, so I have notes and everything like that afterwards. I'm going to try and come back at the end for the last few minutes or around 2 o'clock if I can. So, but thanks in advance and sorry for any inconvenience. I think my notes are written up and in the handouts as well, so I'll just summarize my summary a little bit here. But my overall impressions was, as you can see in the scoring, that I didn't think Metric's application met a minimum standard for it. So I focused most of my information on Georgetown and Urban. I thought both submitted really solid applications that would fit the bill for the district. And so that's a positive in my mind and for the success of this RPP generally. I think that each had their own limitations. And so for me personally, I wouldn't want to cast a final vote, even though I scored it one way or the other, until we had a chance to ask each of those two applicants some follow-up questions, or if there are ways for them to give us assurances or more information on things. And because if it's okay, I'll give kind of both my contrasts and then the points that I think would be useful for more inquiry, but I'm also happy to provide those in writing afterwards or anything like that. And I did these by section. So like, I thought both, again, had sufficient research expertise and expertise in education research. The distinction that I saw where urban in my mind was higher is that I just thought that the research at least presented and summarized in the report was a little bit more high impact and a little bit more relevant to the types of questions that at least I see the RPP doing. And so that gave them a bump there. Similarly, I thought that they had a little bit more direct experience partnering with local governments in what they displayed there, and so a little bit better, and I think just kind of conceptually a little bit better community outreach strategy, but both I think were sufficient and solid. I didn't really have a ton of distinction in terms of current personnel, but where I did see a contrast was in how they related to the advisory committee, where the impression I got, and I would welcome other people's thoughts on it from the GW applications, that it seemed like the application saw GW as leading the creation of the research agenda in coordination with the council, whereas I thought Urban's specifically stated more directly that the advisory council is setting the agenda, and their work kind of flowed from that, and they supported that. And I thought that was at least more consistent with my understanding of how we wanted the advisory committee working, and also would I think more on the questions that that the advisory committee is most interested in. I thought in terms of data security, I thought GW's application was much superior to Urban's, especially given this consortium nature and that we may be started in a virtual environment. And so specifically that they were envisioning a cloud infrastructure or environment that would allow credentialing in, so you only get access to the data you're supposed to. The data live in that environment. They provide the analytical tools to whoever is using it. And also that they were talking more about being able to provide usable data sets back to DC government, which I think is really important. And so for Urban, I thought it was a concern that with 15 entities, it seemed like they were kind of storing data centrally and distributing it to the entities follow their own practices, whereas I think I'd much prefer to see an environment that's centrally controlled by the coordinating entity. So for Urban, I would want to hear more about whether they could create something like that, or if they'd be willing to use something that either OSSI or Octo could provide for it to do that sort of thing. That would be something that I would want to ask before casting a vote. I thought that the security measures for both were sufficient. The big thing for me is that they talked about registering analysis plans publicly, but didn't give a ton of detail on that. And I think that that's really vital to understanding how transparent they will be and at what time they'll register those publicly, because that allows us to track whether there were either implicit or explicit decisions that might bias the results in terms of what they do. And so I'd want to ask more about that. And then I thought that also in terms of the procedures for data quality, validity, and kind of checking the results that Urban provided mostly in their appendices were, I felt, more rigorous than what GW provided. And so I'd want to hear, but GW didn't speak to it as directly in the appendices, so I just want to hear more about how they see that playing out. Those were my general impressions. Thanks again for letting me go first.
I can call on somebody to go next, or there can be a volunteer. Aaron, would you like to go next? You're to the left of Sam on my screen, so I'm gonna go in this order.
Sure, I can. And I'm gonna bring up, so I won't be able to I mean, nobody's like raising hands, but I won't be able to see you if you do. Just interrupt me if something's going on. I'm going to look at my scoring. Oh, I also did want to say, so I do want to share, like Sam did, it's like a quick overview of my thoughts. I do have a crazy moonshot suggestion that I would love your thoughts on, and I recognize that it is probably, yeah, that it's a crazy moonshot, but I would love like 2 minutes to do that in addition to this, if that is okay at some point. Okay, so, and sorry, I'm not trying to be cryptic, that's super weird. All right, so like Sam, I also didn't think that Bitrick, if I'm pronouncing that right, met an initial scoring criteria, and I would actually put them in a category of non-responsive, which we have used, you know, both locally and this also happened at the Department of Ed too. And I'm unclear if they're actually fully eligible. The nonprofit status was maybe a little bit confusing to me. So I will also just focus on GW and Urban's applications, which again, like Sam, I think they're both really strong applications, clearly. Clearly both have significant expertise, you know, both addressed really well all of the categories required of them in the NOI. At the end of the day, I think that the GW plan had a lot more collaboration and partnership plans that sounded more like an RPP to me, and in my experience, particularly having done work with REL Midwest before, and the reasons for that are in kind of, although I'd love more details, but spelled out probably best in the RPP best practices section, where they really focused on having a core shared vision, and there was the associated teaming agreement, rather than individual, the Urbans felt a little bit less cohesively tied to really making sure that the research partners that step into these positions with our practitioners and policymakers, that they are coming in partnership. I didn't get that sense as much, and that is not, that sounds like they're doing something wrong. They're doing great research, but it is quite a different role to work in partnership with practitioners, policymakers, and advisory council. You have to demonstrably not be the expert in the room, and be coming from a really different perspective with entirely different incentive structures and entirely different goals than for traditional research. And so I found that to be much more robust in the GW application, from having that sort of core structure and shared vision, the detailed teaming agreement, the description of how researchers themselves will need to gain capacity in this partnership, that they do not come with all the tools needed to be necessarily a good practitioner partner. And let's see. Also, the advisory committee is interesting. I had a similar sense there, and from having led the development of research agendas with diverse stakeholder groups before, as an early childhood Research Alliance lead, I think that you know, absolutely the advisory committee are the ones guiding that, but it is not it's not a magic process that happens on its own, and it needs significant facilitation. And to that, and I think it also needs room for questions that are not high impact, and there's been a lot of writing on that from various RPPs across the country that, in fact, you know, the majority of the questions they get from practitioners in particular are descriptive. And so really figuring out what all the landscape of those questions and what all of those might be, and in a guided process that takes time. It seemed like it was more a little bit better a little better of an understanding of that work in the GW application. And let's see. Oh, the other thing on data. Yeah, I agree. The cloud setup was better on data security, but I also feel like I would assume Urban could do that if we asked them to. I think what was highlighted in that to me is that one of these potential partners realized that what it means to build an RPP program of a data archive versus one-off research project data sets. So when you build an RPP, you know, longitudinal data system archive, it takes significant investment, a significant amount of time, and then you are able to hold it and distribute data sets from that central location, rather than, you know, cleaning up this data and giving it to this group, and cleaning up that data and giving it to that group. That doesn't really work as well for a comprehensive program. And similarly, there's a lot of great papers. I think they both cite Laura Wentworth's paper talking about how much time they spent a year on that in San Francisco after going a year in the wrong direction. So there's a lot of lessons learned out there. A Rice paper, similarly, from Ruth Lopez Turley, that shows that after a year and a half, they didn't have any products. And why was that? Excellent RPP, no products after a year and a half. So yeah, I'll wrap up with that. I'm really curious to know exactly what they think their first year is going to look like, what products they think they can have. Again, like our most commonly asked question at Ask a Rel was, what do other studies say about X, Y, or Z? So like that, I'm curious to know what they think they will be doing in the first year, how they're going to set up this data archive, how they're going to really partner with our SEA and not burden our SEA to do that work. So I saw many more hints of that in one application than the other.
Okay. Thank you. And I think we'll do everybody come back and do one round, and then we'll go back and sort of share your broader idea too. So thank you. Akeem, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I don't think it's worth spending much time on the first applicant. I think there's general consensus around how we feel about that one. And I had GW and Urban scored very similarly. I think aside from all the points that have been mentioned before, the key question for me boiled down to Urban and the size of their consortium. And I wouldn't feel comfortable moving forward, given that like they have so many partners and it wasn't really clear to me how each partner was handling what. I wouldn't feel comfortable without or going forward without talking to them about that piece. I think that was where I had the biggest question. I also had in my notes, when I looked at their description of the advisory committee collaboration, it wasn't that clear to me the difference between their collaborative partners and the advisory board. And the description of the advisory board struck me as people who would help communicate their findings rather than guide their research. And so I'd have some more questions with Urban about that piece. Other than that, I think like both of them seem like strong when it comes to security and data management. One way or the other, I think both of them would be fine in that piece. So I'd be okay with either of them doing it. I just have questions around Urban and their management of the 18 different 15 different partners that they have.
Okay. Jen, would you like to go next?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. So hi, everybody. Yes, the first one agreed that tech or whatever doesn't meet minimum standards. And so I like the others as well. I think we are very fortunate in the district that we have two very strong candidates. That is very good news. And I do think there are slight differences in tone. And my suggestion, like Sam's, is I wouldn't want, even if we had, I want more questions. I want to give them some questions, both parties, and then get them back to deliberate some further. I think it is interesting. I think a couple questions I had, like Akeem, I have a question for the Urban application to get a better understanding of how they will structure with the different partners. I think it would be good to get an update on the partners. I think some of those partners might have changed in the sense that some of the members that they listed, things might have changed since they submitted. And just get better clarification on the roles and how they're going to manage. 15 is a lot. At the same time, it's a very deep bench with a lot of technical expertise. And for the GW application, I agree with Aaron that the structure was very clear, but I have questions on how would they bring other researchers in to fill voids of where they would need to. Similarly, I think it's interesting that they listed the GW application of hiring researchers full-time when you don't know what the research questions are yet, or the focus. I don't know how you necessarily hire a catch-all to cover. Now, I realize they would not be the only researchers, presumably on the projects, but I would like to hear about the one researcher that's full-time, how they imagine that would work when you don't know what the research topics are. I also found it interesting. Again, I think they were both very responsive and making sure that there is integrity of their research and independence of their research. I was very clear, I think, on the Urban side that they, with their advisory group, that it's very action-oriented. And a lot of their expertise that they shared was very action-oriented, which I think is helpful to understand. In terms of independence, one thing that hasn't come up yet is the finances. I thought it was interesting that Urban said explicitly they did not want district money, that they would come back only if there was something, not very exciting sort of infrastructure-y later, while the GW both asked for annual appropriation as well as assistance with costs for the advisory group. And so I think that is something something to think about. So a question I have for GW is if you didn't get it, so right now there is nothing that I'm aware of in the next year's fiscal year budget, or how would that work? And I think they said they would fundraise, but what does that mean? So that's another question I have. I think the other question I had actually for the GW one as well is, and I might have said sorry, but how they would bring in other research groups, how they would So one seems very broad, but it's unclear entirely how they're organized, and the other one seems very tight, but I don't know how they're going to fill in gaps where they need to. So I think that's another question that I have. And then I think the last, there's just some other small ones that I have, Justin, that I can give you later. For example, I think it was interesting that the GW, identified their ED already, which is great. And does that mean she will no longer be, is it full-time? I think it's a full-time, so she'll no longer be doing GW responsibilities, small things along those edges. Well, I think Urban made it very clear on that they would be hiring for that position full-time. So then there's some other questions around comms and so forth. I did like the GW's, their briefs and infographics and sort of their explicit mention of those sorts of things. I think Urban did as well, but I thought their GW's was more compelling. I think we talked about web podcasts, or not podcasts, but right, some other ways of really disseminating information. So I'll stop there. But I am very excited to do another round. I wouldn't want, I think they're two very strong candidates.
Thanks, Jen. Rebecca?
Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. So I share the sentiment of most before us. I felt like both of them were really strong. I think they had strengths, both had strengths and limitations. And I think if you'd have given me another month, I would have probably flip-flop back a million times. It felt very much like a coin flip at times in the scoring. I think the GW submission felt a little more polished. I think, both of them certainly had the expertise, but Urban's research felt a little like slightly more relevant, higher impact. So they got a little higher score from me there. But it felt like GW edged them out a little bit in their government partnerships and vision. I think the personnel were both strong. I mean, one couldn't read through that and not feel that way. But in looking at it, it felt like GW had more diverse personnel that would be assigned to the project, which I think is also extremely important. I think I'm not saying too much that many of you haven't already said, but I'll try to use my 5 minutes appropriately. But I did like the way that Urban approached the collaboration with the advisory committee better. It felt more in line with the vision, being advisory driven, but I would love to hear more from both of them about what this would look like in practice for year 1, year 3, et cetera, and like how they plan to like maintain relevance as like the world changes daily. And I'd like to hear more too, as others have said, how they'll manage these partnerships. We're going to have a lot of folks from their partners in district government, and I would love to sort of hear from them their vision for that in person. Security felt sufficient for both. I think GW felt more like they handled data management and security, where Urban focused heavily on security, it felt like at some points, but I don't think anything noted by either of them seemed like proprietary, or like it seemed like fairly common practices, and I think they could be implemented by both if the district said this is what you must do. I felt like it was so close on just, they were both seemed sufficiently transparent and accountable. Getting to the financial, I did feel like it was financially even, one being more expensive but didn't need any money versus the other wanting the money being less expensive. But I did have a question that I wonder whether or not accepting money from the districts for this group, do you feel like that might bond us both to the partnership a little better and encourage more accountability versus being completely independent from the group? That's just sort of the question I had when reading it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Susanna?
Hi, thanks. So I would agree with everyone else that Bitrick did not meet our minimum standards. In terms of where I came down between the two, I think they were both really strong applications. But ultimately, when I went through the scoring, I thought that Urban's application was a little bit stronger. So the areas of concern that I had with GW's application was in their independence. They said that they would be going through OSCE to get approval on their research for each project. And I thought that should be the role of the advisory board. So it seemed to me that they were prioritizing the connections with OSSI and the Deputy Mayor for Education over the advisory board, and that definitely gave me pause. In addition, I thought that GW leaned heavily on what other schools within GW had done with in terms of government partnerships and collaboration. So my understanding that is that with GW's application, the School of Education would be the lead entity. But when they're talking about, I think, their collaboration with other entities and their history of working with the government, they were speaking more towards what I think the School of Health had done. And I was also confused from their letter of support from Children's Law Center and Children's Hospital. I didn't find it very compelling that those two entities would really add to the partnership, and that those were the ones that they raised. I think that also Urban was much stronger in terms of their history of engaging outside stakeholders. So their examples they gave of involving the community were a lot more robust than what GW provided, which I think they cited, like having a series at a coffee shop and holding several forums. So perhaps there's more there that they didn't cite, but that was a little bit weak. I like that both partnerships suggested starting small and scaling up. GW already had named an executive director and Urban had not. I didn't, in some ways having an executive director named means that maybe they'd be more ready to hit the ground running, but at the same time, maybe they should have a robust search process to make sure that they're getting the exact right person, not just the person who was there while they were submitting their application. I felt like I didn't have enough expertise to really weigh in on security matters. They both seem strong. Both seemed good looking at data validity and data quality. In terms of financial management, I was also concerned, like Jen, about GW expecting a $500,000 annual contribution from DC government when that had not been promised and hasn't been budgeted. So, as Jen mentioned, they did say that they would do fundraising, but that was like the expectation they built into their budget. But I also had reservations with Urban saying that they would be independent if they didn't get money from district government, but taking money from foundations wouldn't compromise their independence. And I know the foundations they mentioned have very sort of clear education agendas as well. And so, I didn't like that they thought that foundations would guarantee their independence, but taking money from a democratically elected government would compromise their independence. So yes, on the whole, I thought Urban's was a bit stronger, but it's been really interesting to hear from other panelists and things that I did not consider when I was reviewing.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for sharing. It sounds like there's a lot of consensus around both of them are pretty good, which is a good challenge to have. So I think, like, Erin, would you like to go back and sort of like make your idea and proposal, and then we'll start from there.
Sure.
And then I'm not sure if your idea is about how we should proceed or something like that. But yeah, just go ahead and we'll take it from there. This will probably be a little bit more organic.
Sorry to be mysterious. I just wanted to try to reserve a little bit of time, and I'll try and make it quick. So like I said, moonshot. I think, like everyone said, we have two really strong applications, and that puts us in a really lucky position. And as many of us noticed early on, there's they're overlapping organizations on both of the applications, which is cool, and that so many of these people want to be a part of the partnership no matter what, right? And it's been the DC RPP has been a hot topic at NERP every year for the past 2 years. People asking like, who's it going to be? What's going to happen? And people, you know, in those conversations also said a similar thing as to what we see on these applications, that they were just going to endorse all of them. Anybody who comes to me, yes, I will support you because we want to help and we want to be involved, which I think is a really great part of the culture of good RPPs. So I know that the law says that we have to deliberate on these applications, but I do wonder and on the value add for the district of us haggling over 2 really good ones versus possibly going back to council and the executive branch together and saying, we have 2 really strong applications with overlapping folks. Would it be possible to get them in a room together and join forces in some way? I don't see why that probably wouldn't happen at the end of the day anyway. Maybe not these are all, you know, these are all folks doing education research already in the district. These are all folks who have district government partnerships, have networks, and I worry that they also fall along, you know, really clear or obvious dividing lines in education in the district, which we're not alone in. You know, this is the whole country has these problems, but I would love the collaborative opportunity of bringing that together rather than reifying it with a distinction between 2 really good candidates. And so, yeah, if our researchers like can talk and discuss and work this out and the district can leverage what we have together, I think that would be the best bang for our buck, or no buck, depending on our investment there. So that's my weird proposal that I know has is not in the law, and so the law would have to be amended, which is a huge pain in the butt. But I would love to, I don't know, I'd love to hear like, can Urban and GW talk to each other, and what would they do together? What would they both bring to the table together? That was the one question after reading both of them. And like Rebecca said, you can go back and forth in a lot of places. I just, I wonder how they would talk to one another and if possible, work together. So. Thanks everyone for letting me express that.
So can I react to that? Yeah, thanks for that, Erin. I think I have a suggestion that is a little moderated compared to going back to the law and changing it. But I think one of the main questions can be, which actually I had already, was how would you bring in other research groups? You know, the urban side actually said they, and to your point, Erin, I think there's a couple of GW schools overlapped. I think Howard overlapped. Those are 2 off the top of my head that overlapped. But I think, you know, the urban's proposal actually said, I believe, that they are open to the other applicants, right? And so I think I would like to pose an explicit question to both of them on how it would work. And that falls in line to me with the one to GW. Again, how are you going to bring in the other research entities to meet needs? So my suggestion, as opposed to asking that to amending the law or changing the law and asking them to submit somehow a proposal together, is to ask them how they would handle that situation. I don't know what others think.
I think.
Sorry.
Oh, please, Rebecca.
I was just saying, I think I like that better, right? To have sort of one point of of like contact that we're working with. I found myself sort of flipping back and forth. Aaron, when you gave the suggestion, I thought it was a good thing to bring up. But I just want to make sure that like our approach is focused and that we're not just creating a bunch of noise that no one actually listens to. So I do like this idea of asking them, like, how would you bring in? So sort of the best of both worlds. We get to work with all of them, but we don't have to amend the law.
I think both.
I don't believe there's appetite on the council to change the law.
Yeah, I'm sure not.
I think both applications emphasize the importance of having one central spoke to make to provide an administrative role and an organizational role. And I think it would sow confusion by designating two entities as that central administrative role. So I agree with Jen, like when we bring them in to ask about how they would reach out to other partners that weren't part of their initial application. But I wouldn't support going back and asking them to collaborate from the get-go on a combined application.
Can I throw one other piece in? And Aaron, I'm not trying to add to it, but I appreciate you bringing it up. I remember the IPCOR days, and I actually think having a diffused governance structure actually added to some of the challenges that they had. There's lots of great research that came out of that, but actually, I think that actually was not as successful as it could have been because of the diffusion and the lack of focus on who was actually. I know GW, I think, was the head at the time, but again, it was more complicated structure and more diffused. So.
Yeah, that one didn't work. I'd add though that Urban had DC data way back in the day when Jane Hanaway was there. Was that when you were there, Jen? Or
Jane did the value-added work so she had a very discrete question that she was looking at, but it wasn't trying to be an RPP, right? Like it was looking at the value add.
Yeah. I know that either one of them were. I just would say like they both struggled in totally different ways, and neither one here today, working with DC data. So I hope that both have, learned from those experiences. But that's fine. Sorry, I don't know if I need to conclude my kumbaya moment and say that's fine. I wanted to, just to make sure that we're spending our resources effectively, although I agree, like it could just be noise. I didn't want us to spend months haggling over two really good proposals if there was a third way. But yeah, that often does end up just being noise. So I like the idea very much of asking them how they would bring in others, and particularly how they plan to, when you're bringing in others into an RPP, how do you make sure that those other people are good partners to your practitioners?
So one thing, I think this it seems as to me there is appetite to ask for more information in some sort of method, whether that's written, in person, some combination of both. Based on I tried to take notes, scribble down some things. This question of how do you bring in other research entities. There was another question of like a very specific vision of your first year of how you're going to like set up like that. I think multiple people said that year one plan. And then are there other things, I'm just sort of looking through my notes of where you know that you would want more information to see if you could differentiate between the applicants?
I do have other questions, but I don't want to just deluge them with questions. Is there, would there be an efficient process for all of us to put ours together and then maybe, I don't know, rank them or something like that?
Sure. I think what I need to understand just for planning is, how do you want to, are you feeling more written or an in-person meeting? Because if it's an in-person meeting, my team of the willing needs to figure out a way to get these on the calendar, especially with our time crunch with the holidays and such, and we need to give them due notice. So if that's a step that you all are wanting to take for them to do some sort of in-person conversation with you, then we need to, like, we're at the point of, we need to set that up. But if you are, regardless, I think we could set up a shared document for people to drop in questions by a certain date. We could take a look at cleaning them up, like trying to find the cleanup, and then sort of going on there's a set of a number of questions, that follow-up questions that both applicants get, and you give people the time to provide information to you, and then you can review those, deliberate, and then I still encourage you to, you're more than happy to discard the rubric. You can come back to the rubric and update scores and say, hey, Justin, recalculate. Those are options just to sort of keep like a process around, or you just say, hey, we're ready to vote based on that information. Just sort of as process, that's where those are the things that are coming to my mind. Nagesh, is there anything else around process that we need to be aware of?
The only thing is, like, if we were going to invite them to come in person, address your questions, speak to you, because there may be, you could ask a question and then there could be a follow-up question that you want to get addressed. So it could be that you do want to speak with them. I would encourage us to go into some sort of executive session, probably because I don't want, these are public meetings. And so if you're asking questions or asking for follow-up from one entity, I don't necessarily appropriate for the other entity to have either representatives on the call or, quote unquote spies, to glean, from your reactions and to make assumptions based on what you could be looking for. So something to that effect. But it could also be what Justin is saying, a combination. Here's some written questions. They are given to you. They're given to each applicant that we've discounted Bitrix, wholesale, and so we get those back. We have a discussion, and then there could be some follow-up kind of in-person sort of clarity, or what do you mean by this in your question, so that just limits the amount of, because I can imagine if 6 people have even 3 or 4 questions apiece, I mean, we in a meeting for hours, I would imagine. And so having some maybe hybrid approach might be helpful, because you just want to hear from them. You may want to see, like, I think there's a lot to say in your tone. To Aaron's point, the willingness to, and the devotion to what you all envision, or what the district really envisions as part of creation of an RPP. So there's value in that. But I want to make sure that, again, your deliberations are protected, and that we are, we're being thoughtful about it. So that's all I have to say.
I like the hybrid. I think it's fair to Aaron's point and Nagesh to not overwhelm them with questions, but the opportunity to then actually have a discussion. I think it's always helpful.
Yeah,
I
the
do.
hybrid sounds cool, and I'm gonna maybe consider some sort of RPP spy costume for next Halloween, because I enjoy that.
I do encourage you though to think about uniformity of questions though, because I think that there's if you were going to provide them something in writing, asking them both the same questions. If you are going to do an in-person sort of conversation that like it lasts for an hour, there's a script set of questions. Now follow-up questions and clarity can be sort of kind of like an interview. You ask the same people the same things just to sort of keep controls around it, and we could sort of figure that out. Any other thoughts?
Just I hear you on being.
The only other thing.
Yeah.
I echoed. I think there should be some sort of uniformity if we're asking one. I know there's a slight different kind of perspective based upon the application, but if we're asking one entity one question, we should be asking the other one, and then also allowing that time. Whether it's 10 calendar days or something, allowing for us to pose those questions, have them respond in writing, and then have a meeting right afterwards. My connection may be a little bit off, but I'll turn off mine. Did everyone catch that?
Some of it. I think I hear you better when your video's off, actually. Sorry.
From my end.
I think what I heard you say, Nagesh, is.
Yeah, it could be that my computer's been going a little slow today.
Yeah. I think what I heard you say is uniformity of questions is fair, length of time to follow up, and those were the two things I think I heard.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's fine as uniformity of questions. I get why, and that's fine. I think there's just some are clear, some are more targeted to some than others, but I get the point that it should be very as fair as possible, and so they both have an opportunity to clarify their positions.
Would it sound, I realize this is like a hybrid on a hybrid, but could we, I would love if the written questions could potentially be more targeted to places where, like, in your application you say blah, 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 what can you expound on that to tell us, what that means exactly, but perhaps in person, I don't know, we could even send them some topics or questions in advance that they would both perhaps speak to, as a way to try to level things for the in-person conversation.
I mean, we're getting clarity on a very uniform application, right? So I hear, Nagesh, you want to be as fair and even as careful as possible. But so we shouldn't get silly at some point because we're trying to give two different ones. So maybe it starts with seeing what the types of questions are, right? So Justin, if you're talking about having some kind of Google Sheet or so forth, that we can see that then they get sort of organized into themes, where the questions could be asked. We can see how it goes from there. I would hate to waste anybody's time and rehash things because it is going to be, right? We're probably going to keep them on for an hour, probably at the most.
And would we let them have questions for us too? I know if I was them, I would have a bunch of questions. It's particularly if we ask them about their first year's worth of work. They're not going, they have, the advisory committee hasn't met yet, and they don't have data inventories and things like this. So I don't, I would still think that they could speak to their first year activities regardless, but what happens, or are we inviting questions of the district or of the panel as well?
I think we can do our best to answer those consistent with the law. I mean, our agency is like this is sort of an independent like organization. There seems to be, I mean, we've answered these questions before around budget commitment. That question would be the same. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how much more we could tell them. I think we could clarify their questions with the law. We could reassert the law. We could reassert some of the questions that people posed during the NOI process that we shared publicly. But other than that, I just don't I don't think that like me and Nagesh can field those questions to the best of our ability, but I don't think that there's a whole lot more that information that we have on those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I co-sign that. I mean, to the extent that there's questions about the master services agreement that's contemplated in the law, it's just not something that we would be able to really address at this time because it would be specific, those would be specific terms that have to be later negotiated. So I just couldn't necessarily opine on any of that at this juncture because primarily also I don't know who's the kind of the in charge of that process and who's going to do it. So whether it's OSSI, whether it's OCP, whether there's questions I think around that.
So it's about 1:30. So it sounds like next steps. It looks like as like an overarching like the path forward would be as a group, we need to think about the questions we're going to provide them to respond to in writing and set up an opportunity for them to answer questions or present in person for approximately 1 hour. I think I'm still just on the side of management trying I have no problem with people asking specific questions to the applicants based on sort of like at the appropriate time, like when they're interviewing, but just like for the sake of just like managing the process, like trying to keep it as uniform as possible. I also like the idea of providing some structure to the in-person piece of like, there'll be 5 questions. They'll be on these topics, these topics, these topics, these topics. Like maybe you say you'll go through certain parts of your NOI, right? You'll go through certain part, like question about advisory group management, question about how you set up 1 year, question about how you bring in new people, and sort of go and let them sort of like and frame it as this is your opportunity to do an in-person pitch in your NOI too. It's like an in-person presentation of your NOI. And that would be sometime in early December. So giving them the opportunity, we would let's say we use the holidays kind of mess us up. We use the next week to sort of figure out our questions. We provide them with a letter that says, hey, here's a set of questions. They submit those a little bit prior to the presentation. We do the presentation in like the second week of December-ish. And then I think that would still keep us on track. Does that feel right? Because like it is, what is today? Today's the 13th of November. If we use next week to figure out what questions we're going to ask, we provide them the letter the following week. That's the week of Thanksgiving, so no one's going to be doing that much. So that gives them the week of the 30th, the week of the 7th. Let's say they turn in written materials on the 14th of December with some sort of, I was giving them the weekend. I was going to give them about 2 weeks, but it just depends on when we get out the door. I was thinking 10 business days. I also like to give people I don't think we're going to read on Friday over the weekend necessarily. Sometimes it's just like giving them the weekend. That's how I'm nice, Jen. Try to be nice. The 14th, the 11th or the 14th ish, and then we try to set up conversations in that week. But then that means that either we're going to have to be in we're going to have to, like, that's going to be it. Like, we're going to have to figure out the voting process. Like, we're going to have to move forward in the week of the 21st through the 31st, or to the 31st there. So we'll have to have either something before Christmas or shortly after that. Does that feel like a good timeline? Like, if people were going to go MIA for 2 weeks in December, this may mess up your plan at least for 2 hours or so.
No MIA in the foreseeable future, y'all. but
that would be like the general, and I can send that out in an email of just like what the timeline would look like. It's going to be very, very quick. So it looks like there would be at least 2 more meetings. One where you would meet with the representatives. I would try to set that up as on the same day, 1 hour apiece if I can, but we might not be able to do that, but we'll see. And then another meeting to select. So we would be doing it in 5 meetings, approximately, maybe 6 if we do 2 meetings. So two separate days with applicants. Does that feel?
So we need to do, can you hear me? We need to do 3 meetings essentially between the 14th and the 22nd or the 23rd.
Right. 2 or 3, depending on scheduling with the individuals. Plus,
right.
Yeah. So I think like next steps are I will try to firm up sort of an action plan and get this something back to you Monday-ish to like start putting in questions, and we can go back and forth on SharePoint regarding questions. I'm foreseeing probably between no more than 10 questions, and probably putting and also from experience with doing this is like putting a response limit too of like, you know, I think you want to manage the amount of content you get, because it seems like both applicants are rather verbose with a lot of information, but it's just, and then we would probably send some sort of notification to the applicants that this is how we're anticipating to proceed. They would do some sort of presentation over their broad strategy and answer a few questions in the course of an hour in front of the panel, and have the opportunity to ask us questions back, and then we would go. All right. So one thing you all asked me to do, and I can share my screen again. It's you wanted sort of a bibliography of resources. So I had an Aussie staffer pull together resources of RPP best practices. That's in the SharePoint document here that you can go to. You can feel free to add more there. It's a long list, but I'm sure you have your own, like, I know several people sort of referenced documents. If you wanted to share those with the group, that is there. It also sounds like one of sort of the lingering issues that I've been sort of slow walking is Sam had raised, and I know Sam's not back, Sam had raised the need for bringing in someone to talk about data privacy or security. But like it sounds as there wasn't a lot of like everyone's felt rather satisfied around that particular piece. Is there still a need to sort of find someone to speak to you about that, or is it something that would sort of take? We feel like the applicants have met the threat, like the minimum threshold for security, and then we would have to lay out the specifics of that in some sort of agreement, whatever that is. It doesn't seem like it's a point of differentiation for either of the applicants, is what I'm trying to say.
even though I felt like they were a little different, I feel like the district has the knowledge to set the standard, and so they could, and I think to your point about there not being a difference, I think either partner could meet that standard.
Good.
I agree with that. We don't need to ask anybody.
Are there other thoughts for the good of the order? I think
Yeah, I was wondering if we could use the remaining time to delve into differences that we came across in the applications a little bit more. So we just had the one round of comments, and maybe we can answer some of our questions by, an internal discussion.
Sure. Do we want to sort of do another, like, go through and just say areas that you're curious in to sort of help sort of guide our sort of question formulation process? We can do that for like the next 20 minutes. That works. Susanna, would you like to start?
Sure. So I think that one area that we had differences amongst ourselves was how they were going to collaborate with the advisory committee, and with some people coming down on the side of preferring GW's method to Urban Institute's. So I didn't really sense a big difference between the two, but maybe I overlooked aspects that other people noticed. So I guess maybe if someone who preferred the GW method could speak to a little more specifics about what you liked about it, and someone who preferred the Urban Institute could speak to that.
Sorry, I was actually just looking for it, and then I can, then yes, then I'd be happy to, but I'm trying to find it.
While Aaron's looking, some of the notes that I have, Susanna, these are just my own notes that I have. I have to go up and pull open and review it again. The thing that differentiated for me, and we'll see if this triggers for anyone else, I like the way, again, the GW's group talked about the ways of disseminating information to the advisory group. I thought that was very interesting. I also thought it was really interesting that the note I put for the urban side was very clearly stating that they would help provide training and best practices on local data and national RPPs. There was also a focus of they talked, I think, Aaron, to your point, that it takes a lot of work when it's a large advisory group, right? And it's going to take people lots of different expertise and backgrounds, and to try to get them on at least making sure everyone has the same ground floor of certain topics around data and research questions and all the rest of it. So I thought that was interesting. That's something I noted in particular that Erica had mentioned.
All right, I was on. So I liked that they, in GWs, they framed it as a learning agenda, which has been I think they could have fleshed that out to explain what that means a little bit more, but that's been kind of a turning point in the RPP world, I guess a few years ago, to reflect that it's everybody who it's not just like research questions that you come up with and you pose to the researchers and they go and answer them and bring the answers back, but that it is things that like in a classroom setting that you want to take on together and learn together, and that everyone there has a learning curve. And I'm sure folks working in RPPs right now could describe that even better and give some examples of what that means. And then I appreciated too that the GW application talked about what it means to come to consensus when you do have a shared vision. So and really committing to that shared vision first, and then reaching consensus across a large and diverse group after that. And I'm trying to find where they outlined a lot of the timeline steps. That's what I'm not seeing now, but like how there was more of an explanation of how long that would take to, oh, that's right. They talked about, of course, this was pre-pandemic, but how many meetings they envisioned having in person and remotely, and why, and sort of the nuts and bolts of those conversations, which I really appreciated having experienced them. It's like consensus doesn't necessarily organically appear, and so you actually really have to do some not persuading, but you have to be really intentional and I think focused on a goal to get people, like we are doing now, to get people to keep coming back and return, and making sure that you're productive, making sure that your meetings are meaningful for the advisory committee, that and that you actually get somewhere. The feedback that we used to hear is in the beginning is that folks felt like they would come to like a research agenda setting meeting and express all their ideas, and everybody would be all over the place, and then researchers would go back and decide what they thought people were saying later and then bring it back to the table. And now RPPs are much better at doing that work in partnership with the folks at the table. So you kind of, it's got to be done one way or the other, but I thought the GW application reflected better that you actually, that work does need to happen regardless, and it's better to be done with the advisory committee than not talking about it and then I don't know where it's happening. And setting out those, like how many meetings it would take to get there, and it could take even more. And they also talked about the stakeholder advisory groups, which would have to like, quite frankly, there's no way that our larger advisory committee is going to get really feasible, actionable, specific questions. Your smaller advisory groups, which Urban had also, and I'm blanking on the name that they gave to them, but they had like a project team. So those project teams are going to be doing very similar work to the advisory committee, the like little microcosms. And so I thought one, built the structure for that a little bit better.
Erin, that reminds me actually, another distinction that I think was one is the project teams. I think both entities, so this is a little different, Susanna, than the advisory group, right? But it is the stakeholders. And where do the stakeholders get pulled in? And I believe GW talked about the stakeholders and the agencies would get briefed in draft form, right? I think that's what I remember. And so you guys should correct me if I'm getting it wrong. And that the Urban's team talked about having them in on the design early on, that they sit at the table early on in the part of the process. That is what I remember. So I think that's just another distinction. Now, whether that is just something that one highlighted but both plan on doing, I don't know. This is why we bring them in to talk about it. But that's another distinction I remember.
As someone who's not deeply immersed in the education world, I found Urban's application easier to understand. I felt like GW's, there was a lot of like catchphrases and sometimes a little bit of a word salad. Like, how many times can you say like, the word independence, where I'd like to see you demonstrate that more. But it's been like a week since I read through them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was hoping for both of them. if they, the qualities that they described that they would want for their collaborative work, if they could basically, if they could post hoc apply those to one of the projects that they described to tell us, like, you know, how did this project meet the goals that you set out to do? If and how did you assess independence and validity? How did you assess local impact and responsiveness? What would you do differently? And say if it wasn't partnership work, what would you do differently to make this more like partnership work? All of the research that was, the majority of the research that was in there, these were not, like, one appendix was full of research papers that didn't really describe the nuts and bolts of partnership work. So yeah, I wonder, you know, to that end, those have actually been some of the main, there's now an RPP journal. That's been some of the main, like, products of RPPs over the past 5 years, is making a space for best practices and, like, what works and what doesn't in actually how to do this work. And so I would expect they would probably also, whoever is doing this, and maybe one of the partners, but that they would have thoughts on how they would contribute to that field too, and maybe with work that they've already done. Like I was saying, there's a couple really, maybe 3, Rice, Stanford, and I'm blanking on the other one. I'll remember. There's 3 really good papers on what it means to set up data. That sounds little, but it's not at all little. And most of the RPPs that are setting up a program and not ad hoc projects, you know, it takes at least a year to get data ready. And so how do you do that? How do you share it? How do you work with your state or local education agencies in building the infrastructure, ensuring it's good, and building capacity on both sides? Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of the specifics of that in either one, and that could be because they don't know enough about our local data resources. But you know, I think they could apply that, you know, that RPP knowledge to any of their prior work to tell us how it fits in. That was not a clear question at all, I realize, so I can refine it to make it possibly usable.
I jotted a little bit of it down. It's just like, how do you set up the basic? How do you set up the basic infrastructure for data systems for collecting, sharing, storing, and then sort of give people the right access at the right, like, that basic initial setup? Like, how do you get the stuff? What does the relationship with, you said the state education agency, but like any data source, like, what's your relationship to sort of like get the basic infrastructure set up for the data that you need? And then how do you build capacity on both sides, like with your researchers and then also with your advisory committee and
yeah, there's so many RPPs now that there's recently a book of telling them, like, what not to do, and how, like, you are not to walk down to the IT desk of your SEA and be like, can I have this? I need these data. And so, you know, fortunately, our RPP work has been around long enough that there is this, like, robust ways of not to do it and how to be most productive and how to be a good partner. And that's what I'm looking for the most. I feel like we're at a point in the RPP field now that we can raise the bar on that and have folks that really really understand the work that has come before them.
Erin, is the master data agreement going to be a partly where that gets ironed out? I mean, some of it is the details of the data that are shared automatically, but some of it of that, I don't know if it was imagined to be processed as well. But I hear you on that, and it'll be very important to build on the expertise of others, you know, in other states and jurisdictions, other localities. But I also wonder if that's also going to be managed once the entity is identified, right? That's also on the responsibility of the agency as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I can share this paper from Stanford, who Laura Wentworth is one of the co-authors. And the agreements is a huge part of that work, but there's so much more that RPP staff now realize they needed. So let's see, I think where did they talk about the data infrastructure they needed, and then organizing and how to exchange data once you have that infrastructure and how it looks different for different types of data. And then in I guess what they see is like their future of data infrastructure now that they've built what they have, and how they talk about agreements and like how agreements play into each of those categories. Really, they're not the whole ball game, but they are really important for sure. Hopefully, the RPP is able to get set up with one master research services agreement to start with, and then can add on schools or LEAs or additional small things as needed.
Okay.
Hey,
So, go ahead.
Sorry, I've got one question, and I know we're approaching time. I guess since there's general agreement that both of the two moving forward are really strong applicants, and we're lucky to have two highly capable entities that's able to do this work. I guess my question is, in terms of our follow-up, then what's the thing that we're looking for to distinguish one over the other? I don't know. I had like my scores were like neck and neck. So.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Akeem. I think that's a good question.
Yeah, for me, it's the partnership stuff. We already have not enough, but we have contracted research already, and like these folks are all in DC already. We had EdCore, and that wasn't really great, and we had other stuff that wasn't. We've had ups and downs, and so I want to know. To me, the value add is setting up this larger program and